I want you to just completely erase your preconceived notions of what a crime scene looks like.
Right, because usually when something violent happens, we expect boundaries.
Exactly. We picture a perimeter. We imagine, yellow police tape stretching across a lawn.
Flashing red and blue lights everywhere.
Yeah, a strictly defined space that's cordoned off from the rest of the world. It feels manageable because it's physically contained.
A bad thing happened, but it happened right there, inside the tape.
Right. But for this deep dive, that imagery is entirely useless. I need you to picture this instead. It's the early 2000s in central China.
Okay.
You're standing on the edge of these vast, completely unlit rural road networks in Henan province.
Just endless dirt paths.
Endless, sprawling stretches connecting deeply impoverished, profoundly isolated farming villages. And it is the dead of night.
And we are talking about absolute darkness here.
Yes, absolutely no ambient light bleeding over the horizon from major cities, no street lamps at all. Just this heavy, suffocating darkness for thousands of square miles.
And in that pitch black, there is no yellow tape.
None.
There's no perimeter to be found. The whole concept of containment just, well, it doesn't exist in this geography at this point in history.
There's just a man on a bicycle.
Wow.
Yeah, he's pedaling silently through that dark. He's crossing provincial borders entirely undetected by any authority.
Just slipping right past sleeping towns.
Navigating purely by the moonlight on the dirt roads. And he is leaving behind a trail of unimaginable, systematic devastation.
It's terrifying.
Today's deep dive is a comprehensive criminal profile of a man who looked at that vast, unprotected landscape and basically turned it into his own private hunting ground.
His name is Xinhai.
But history, and the terrifying legacy he left behind, remembers him by a much darker title, the Monster of Henan.
It's such a chilling moniker, and honestly, from a purely clinical, sociological perspective, it is entirely earned.
Yeah, we're analyzing one of the most prolific, brutal, and just mathematically anomalous serial killers in modern history.
The scale of the violence here defies almost every traditional criminological model we use.
So our mission today for you, the listener, is to act as your investigative guides. I'm going to break down the hard data, the geography, the incredibly weird timeline of his attacks, and the forensic challenges.
And the numbers are staggering.
67 confirmed murders, 23 rapes, 10 serious injuries.
Across 4 different provinces.
And the detail that makes this entirely distinct from a Western profile, he did this almost entirely using basic, untraceable farm tools.
Right. And while the data and the forensic countermeasures are horrifying, my goal today is to peel back the layers and provide you with the sociological context.
Because he didn't operate in a vacuum.
Exactly. He didn't just drop out of the sky into Henan province. He was a byproduct of his environment, operating during this rapid, almost dizzying modernization of China at the turn of the millennium.
We have to examine how a massive floating population of migrant workers created this perfect ecosystem for a predator.
Combined with deeply systemic, structural law enforcement gaps in those rural areas, it was an environment tailor-made for a killer who had absolutely nothing to lose.
And to piece this together, we're pulling from a heavy stack of source material. We've got academic criminological analyses dissecting power-assertive killers.
We have historical research focused heavily on the unique challenges of rural Chinese policing during an economic boom.
Plus contemporary news reports from the early 2000s that tracked his eventual capture and his incredibly brief trial.
Synthesizing all this material really paints a picture of a society in extreme transition.
An Asian struggling desperately to maintain order while simultaneously undergoing unprecedented economic growth.
And the friction between those two realities, that is exactly where the monster thrived.
I want to check in with you, the listener, right at the top here. The details we are going to dissect today are exceptionally brutal.
Very grim, very clinical.
Yeah, deeply unsettling. But understanding the mechanics of this case is crucial. It's essentially a masterclass in how systemic vulnerabilities can be exploited.
The invisible structural cracks in the pavement of a rapidly changing society.
Exactly. It shows us the terrifying endpoint of what happens when a human being falls through every possible societal safety net. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Let's go back to the absolute beginning, because to understand a void this deep, we have to look at the exact environment that carved it out.
Right. Yang wasn't born a monster.
No, he was forged in a very specific type of crucible.
The genesis of this kind of profound act of nihilism is rarely a sudden snap. It's not a light switch flipping.
So what is it?
It's the slow, agonizing accumulation of marginalization, isolation, and systemic neglect over decades.
Looking at the biographical data, Yang Xinhai was born on July 17, 1968.
In Yangtaozhuang village.
Right, in Xinhai County, within Henan province. Now, to contextualize this geographically and economically, Henan is China's most populous province.
And in the late 60s and 70s, it was synonymous with deep agrarian poverty.
Yang was the fourth of 6 children. And when the sources mention poverty, we need to be incredibly precise about the extreme deprivation here.
It wasn't just being poor.
No, they were considered among the absolute poorest in a village of 2,000 households. The data indicates they regularly had to forage for wild vegetables.
Literally pulling weeds from the earth just to avoid starvation.
Yes, and the family's primary residence was a dilapidated shack that functioned dually as a cow stall.
Oh, wow.
He was a child living in absolute destitution, sharing his sleeping quarters with livestock.
Which is a fundamental starting point for any psychological profile.
How so?
Well, if we apply criminological research, specifically looking at Edwin Sutherland's theories regarding how criminal behavior is internalized from our environment, childhood imprinting in these conditions is massive.
Sutherland's differential association theory, right?
Exactly. It suggests that the values we place on human life are learned from our surroundings. Living in a space shared with livestock, dealing with chronic, painful food insecurity.
It creates a baseline of profound trauma.
Right. It communicates clearly and repeatedly to a developing child that their intrinsic value to society is basically non-existent.
That they're essentially equivalent to the animals they sleep next to.
Yes, exactly.
But the data throws a fascinating curveball here. He wasn't a stereotypical violent delinquent from day one.
Oh.
The records show he was actually recognized as a highly intelligent student.
Interesting.
Yeah, he possessed artistic talent and even won several school awards for his drawing skills. There was undeniable potential there.
So he had the intellect to engage with the system.
He did, but despite that intelligence, the timeline shows he drops out of junior high school in 1985, at the age of 17.
And he doesn't just quietly stop attending.
No, he fabricates an exit. He leaves a fake letter for his family, claiming he got accepted into a prestigious boarding school, and he just runs away.
Wow. He severs ties completely.
Entirely. With his family, his education, any formal institutional support system.
That severance, that deliberate, calculated lie to escape, is really where the schizoid psychological profile begins to take tangible shape.
Because of the isolation.
Exactly. Even before he ran away, the sociological data notes his extreme social isolation within his peer group. He was widely known in his village as a loner with absolutely no friends.
Right.
In academic literature on serial killers, this kind of profound, unbroken adolescent isolation is a massive red flag.
It frequently indicates early schizoid or antisocial personality traits.
Yeah. These individuals suffer from a complete lack of peer bonding, which effectively stunts the development of empathy.
Because empathy is a learned skill.
Exactly. It's honed through social friction, shared experiences, emotional reciprocity. If you never form connections with others, you never learn to value the internal lives of others.
Other people simply become objects in your environment.
Precisely.
So he runs away in 1985, an isolated 17-year-old, and he enters what sociologists call the floating population.
The Liudong Renku.
Walk us through the mechanics of that. What is the day-to-day reality for an undocumented teenager entering the manual labor force in the late 80s?
Well, the Liudong Renku was the massive churning engine of China's economic boom. We are talking about hundreds of millions of rural citizens migrating to urban centers.
To work in construction, manufacturing, manual labor.
Right. But here is the critical mechanism. Because they were leaving their registered hometowns without official state permission, they were largely undocumented in their new cities.
They existed in this legal gray area.
Exactly. This meant they had absolutely no social safety net, no access to local health care, no right to public education, and crucially, zero legal protections in the workplace.
Jesus, so for a teenage runaway like Yang, who was already socially detached...
It was a brutal Darwinian existence. He traveled across North and East China, taking exhausting, dangerous jobs in coal mines and on construction sites.
And the systemic exploitation in these sectors was rampant, wasn't it?
Oh, standard operating procedure. Foremen and bosses would simply withhold or entirely refuse to pay these laborers their agreed-upon wages.
It's a terrifying vulnerability. You do the back-breaking work, hauling bricks for 14 hours a day, and at the end of the month, the boss just refuses to pay you.
And the sheer helplessness of that situation is staggering.
Because if you're an undocumented migrant, You can't walk into a police station and file a grievance.
You are administratively invisible to the state.
Right.
And for someone like Yang, who already felt profoundly marginalized, experiencing this kind of repeated systemic theft would have acted as a powerful, toxic catalyst.
It ferments a deep resentment.
Not just toward a specific boss, but toward the entire structure of human society. He's being taught a very dangerous lesson.
The rules of society do not protect him.
Therefore, why should he be bound by the rules of society?
And we see that resentment begin to materialize into behavioral escalation, tracking perfectly with his timeline.
It starts small, right?
Yeah, testing the waters of criminality. In 1988, he's working in Xi'an, and he steals a metal tray from a restaurant where he was employed.
A metal tray.
Yeah, he gets caught and serves a brief stint in a labor camp. Then, in 1991, he is in Xinhai, Hebei province. He gets caught for theft again.
Back into the labor camp system.
Right. And the sources note a critical development during these stints. He didn't just serve his time quietly. He actually organized and led a small gang of beggars,
Committing coordinated burglaries and physical assaults.
He is essentially receiving a higher education in the criminal underworld.
Labor camps, particularly the Laoyo or re-education through labor facilities of that era, are notoriously efficient criminal universities.
He went in as a petty thief who stole a tray and came out as an organized gang leader.
He is refining his ability to operate on the absolute fringes of society, but more importantly, he's learning how to prey on others.
Because a beggar gang isn't just asking for spare change.
No, it's often a territorial, coercive operation involving extortion and intimidation. He's learning how to assert dominance and survive through active predation.
Which brings us to 1996. And looking at the data, this is the massive, unavoidable turning point in his evolution.
Okay.
He is in Zumadian, back in Henan province. He is convicted, but this time it is not for a property crime.
It's not theft.
No. He is convicted of attempted rape.
Wow.
He violently attacks a woman, but the victim fights back with such incredible, desperate ferocity that she actually bites off a significant portion of his tongue.
Oh my God.
Yeah. He's convicted of the assault and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He serves his time and is released somewhere around late 99 or early 2000.
And shortly after that release, the horrific mass murders began.
Now, I have to push back firmly on the academic consensus here.
I welcome the friction. What are you seeing in the data?
The sociological theories want to point to the poverty and the unpaid wages as the main driver of his nihilism.
Right, the systemic exploitation.
But poverty and exploitation, while tragic, are incredibly common. Tens of millions of migrant workers faced unpaid wages, slept in squalor, and endured terrible conditions.
And they did not become mass murderers.
Exactly. Poverty alone simply does not create a killer of this terrifying magnitude. I argue that this 1996 incident is the actual ignition switch.
The severed tongue.
Yes. This violent, permanent physical disfigurement combined with the extreme humiliation of a thwarted sexual assault and a long prison sentence.
It's the tripwire.
It's his definitive villain origin story stressor. It flips him from a resentful criminal into an apex predator with a targeted apocalyptic rage against the human race.
I see why you want to isolate that physical trauma as the singular ignition switch. But viewing it in a vacuum ignores the cumulative pressure.
The pressure made the switch volatile.
Right. The tongue-biting incident wouldn't have resulted in a mass murder if the preceding 20 years hadn't completely eroded his baseline empathy. However, if we connect this to the bigger picture of clinical profiling, specifically Robert Herr's work on psychopathy and violent escalation, your analysis of it being the final catalyst is highly accurate.
Because many serial offenders require a definitive triggering event.
Exactly, to shatter their final psychological barriers. The humiliation of the thwarted assault is massive, but the permanent physical mutilation of his tongue is key.
It would have severely affected his speech.
Creating a lisp or a slur, it served as a constant, inescapable physical reminder of his failure, his emasculation, and his ultimate rejection by society.
Every time he spoke, he was reminded of his trauma.
And this interacts violently with his existing schizoid alienation. He already felt like an outcast. Now he is a physically disfigured, imprisoned outcast.
And the literature points out that individuals who feel profoundly worthless often try to compensate by committing crimes to assert dominance.
When Yang walks out of those prison gates in late '99, he's no longer looking to steal a metal tray. He's looking to assert absolute, terrifying power over life and death.
He steps out of that prison, but he doesn't step into a void. He steps into a country that is uniquely and tragically vulnerable to the exact type of predator he has just become.
The environment he was operating in.
Exactly. Let's examine the systemic law enforcement failures and the absolute logistical chaos of rapid urbanization that allowed him to remain completely invisible.
While slaughtering dozens of people for 3 terrifying years.
Yeah. To understand the mechanics of how he got away with this for so long, we have to dissect the massive, almost unbelievable divide between urban and rural law enforcement resources.
The statistical data on this disparity is just staggering.
Let's look at a major urban center at the time, like Wuhan or Shanghai. The police-to-citizen ratio was roughly 1 officer for every 466 citizens.
A dense, highly monitored, reactive environment.
But then you look at the rural interior, the exact agrarian areas Yang was specifically targeting. The ratio plummets to an astonishing 1 officer for every 2,386 citizens.
Wow. 1 to nearly 2,400.
Imagine you are a rural precinct captain in Henan. You literally have a handful of officers responsible for vast, unpaved tracts of farmland, dense forests, and dozens of isolated villages.
And those rural officers were starved for basic operational resources. They lacked funding for fuel, manpower to patrol.
And crucially, they lacked technological infrastructure.
We are talking about an era where rural police stations did not have access to centralized digital databases. They didn't have rapid DNA sequencing technology.
So if a rural investigator found a bloody fingerprint on a door frame,
They were often still manually searching through physical paper fingerprint cards with a literal magnifying glass.
a completely analog system trying to catch a highly mobile threat.
And the fragmentation of the system wasn't just technological, it was deeply jurisdictional. Chinese law enforcement was completely siloed by province.
It's like having a multi-million-dollar home security system, but the camera on the front door absolutely refuses to communicate with the camera on the back door.
That analogy is perfect. A police department in Henan was focused solely on crimes occurring within Henan.
Because their officers were judged and funded based entirely on local case closure rates.
Yeah, exactly. There was almost zero professional or financial incentive to look beyond their own provincial borders.
So let me make sure I am fully grasping the terrifying reality of this logistical gap.
Go ahead.
If you're a disciplined killer like Yang Xinhai, and you commit a mass murder in a farmhouse in Henan, and then you just hop on your bicycle, ride through the dark, and pedal across a provincial line into Hebei,
Right.
does your entire criminal profile essentially just reset at the border, like stepping through a magical, invisible force field?
This raises an important question about the unintentional consequences of macroeconomic reform. Yes, you essentially hit the reset button every time you crossed a border.
You're just a ghost again.
The cops in Xinhai have no idea who you are, they don't know about the massacre you committed yesterday, and they certainly aren't calling the cops in Henan to compare notes.
That is insane.
And the reason a man like Yang can move so freely across those borders without triggering suspicion is intimately tied to the relaxation of the hukou system.
We need to explain how this works.
Yeah.
The hukou is the household registration system in China, right?
Correct. Traditionally, it's strictly tied a citizen to their birthplace. Your access to social services, food rations, and legal residence was locked to that specific geographic location.
Under the Mao era, movement was heavily monitored.
Very strictly controlled. You couldn't simply leave your agricultural village and move to a city without explicit, documented state permission.
But to fuel the massive economic boom of the 90s and 2000s, the government realized they needed cheap, mobile labor.
So they relaxed those rigid restrictions to allow the Liudong Renku, the floating population, to travel freely to where the construction and manufacturing jobs were.
So the state essentially opens the floodgates.
Wide open.
Suddenly, you have an environment where hundreds of millions of undocumented people are constantly on the move. They're flowing back and forth across provincial lines.
Taking temporary cash jobs, living in unregistered housing, sleeping in train stations.
And because of this massive influx of bodies, the local police simply lost the logistical ability to track who was actually in their district on any given day.
The relaxation of the hukou created an undeniable economic miracle, pulling millions out of poverty, but simultaneously it created a massive systemic blind spot.
Yang Xinhai used this logistical chaos as his personal camouflage.
To a rural cop in Hebei, Yang wasn't a serial killer from Henan. He was just another anonymous dirt street face in a sea of millions of itinerant laborers.
But there's another sociological factor here that is deeply unsettling, and it actively contributed to the rising body count.
The state policy of Liqiuending.
Yes, which roughly translates to maintaining public stability. It's a core tenet of the political culture at the time. Explain the mechanics of this. How did a policy designed to pursue public stability actually make the rural public exponentially less safe?
Well, Liqiuending is the political mandate that the appearance of a harmonious, orderly, and perfectly functioning society must be preserved at all costs.
It wasn't just a slogan.
Not at all. It was a key performance indicator for local officials. In practice, this meant that when these horrific mass murders began happening, the local authorities were highly incentivized to suppress the information.
They didn't want to cause a mass panic.
They certainly didn't want to look incompetent to their superiors in the central government, and they didn't want to damage the economic reputation of their region.
By admitting a monster was loose.
So the news of these gruesome crimes was actively censored by local media or severely underreported as isolated domestic incidents.
Which leads directly to the most grim, tragic consequence of this entire deep dive. Think about this from the perspective of the victims.
The isolated farmers?
These impoverished rural farmers living in unlocked, single-story brick houses at the edge of dark dirt roads. They were completely, totally unaware that one of the most prolific mass murderers in human history was operating in their own backyards.
They had absolutely no idea they needed to lock their doors, buy guard dogs, or stand watch at night.
The local state's intense desire to prevent public panic ensured that the victims remained utterly, blissfully defenseless right up until the moment he swung the hammer.
It is the ultimate devastating paradox of the bureaucratic system. In prioritizing the illusion of absolute safety, they practically guaranteed the reality of the slaughter.
Which brings us to the spree itself. The actual mechanical breakdown of what Yang Xinhai did in the dark between 2000 and 2003.
Let's do a clinical analysis of his modus operandi.
The terrifying efficiency of his attacks and the mathematics behind the madness. Because the sheer scale of the violence is just hard to wrap your head around. He officially confessed to 26 separate attacks,
which resulted in 67 murders,
operating across Henan, Shandong, Anhui, and Hebei provinces.
And it is vital to note the nature of these crimes. These were not simple, targeted homicides.
Right, he didn't just kill an individual who slighted him.
He annihilated entire micro-communities.
Yeah, and researchers have actually run deep mathematical models on the timeline of his 26 attacks. They found something they call the Devil's Staircase model.
The power law, right?
Yeah, they applied a mathematical power law to his crime timeline, finding an exponent of roughly 1.4.
Now, what does that actually mean for the listener?
To put it simply, think of a power law like the buildup of a sand pile. You drop grains of sand one by one. The pile grows steadily until it reaches a critical angle of repose.
Okay.
At that exact point, dropping just one more tiny grain of sand causes a massive, unpredictable avalanche. Then, the pile settles, and the buildup begins again.
I see.
What the Devil's Staircase model shows is that Yang's timeline wasn't a steady, predictable graph of one murder every month. It was bursty.
He would experience this internal psychological buildup and then trigger an avalanche of extreme violence,
committing multiple mass murders in a single week.
And then, abruptly, there would be a long, flat period of complete inactivity.
A cooling-off period where the sand started building again.
That statistical anomaly is deeply revealing about his neurology. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that this wasn't random, chaotic, or financially motivated violence.
The Devil's Staircase pattern shows a highly regulated, almost biological internal cycle.
He would experience a slow, agonizing buildup of psychological pressure, an irresistible urge to exert physical dominance and inflict pain,
which would eventually culminate in a rapid cluster of murders, the vertical steps on the staircase.
Once that horrific pressure was released through the act of killing, he would physically and mentally retreat.
Assimilate seamlessly back into the invisible floating population.
Work a menial job and lay dormant until the internal pressure reached that critical angle again. It's a psychological cycle of addiction translated directly into applied mathematics.
And when that pressure peaked and the avalanche triggered, his tactical discipline was absolutely terrifying. He operated almost exclusively in the dead of night.
Usually between midnight and 3 a.m.
He specifically targeted rural farmers whose homes were geographically isolated from their neighbors, often surrounded by high crops or thick trees that muffled sound.
And his primary MO, the core tenet of his methodology, to ensure he left absolutely no witnesses, was the complete eradication of the household.
He didn't sneak in and sneak out.
He systematically slaughtered entire multi-generational families sleeping under one roof. Grandparents, parents, toddlers, no one was spared.
We have to closely examine his weapons of choice because they reveal his terrifying pragmatism. He didn't use firearms.
Which are highly regulated, expensive, and incredibly difficult to obtain in China.
He didn't forge specialized hunting knives. He used common, everyday rural tools.
Heavy iron hammers, meat cleavers, wood chopping axes, and steel shovels.
It's almost a dark perversion of his own resume. The state and the labor camps trained him to build things and move earth with shovels and hammers.
And he weaponized that exact manual training against the very people he was working alongside.
Exactly. From a forensic standpoint, selecting these weapons is brilliant in its brutal simplicity. They are entirely untraceable.
Every single farming household in a 1,000-mile radius owns a shovel or a heavy meat cleaver.
Furthermore, they're functionally silent. A heavy hammer blow to a sleeping victim does not wake the neighbors a mile down the dirt road the way the crack of a gunshot would.
It allowed him to maintain the crucial element of surprise and absolute control within the confined, dark space of a small, rural home.
Let's talk about his forensic countermeasures, because this is where the popular media image of a simple, uneducated drifter completely falls apart.
He used a bicycle to travel between his murder scenes.
Think about the mechanical brilliance of that. A bicycle doesn't have a license plate to track. It doesn't require gasoline.
So he never has to interact with a clerk at a gas station.
Crucially, a man walking a bike doesn't get stopped at motorized police checkpoints on the main provincial highways.
He could navigate the tiny, unpaved agricultural footpaths and irrigation ditches that police cruisers couldn't even physically access.
Furthermore, the data shows he went to extreme lengths to procure entirely new clothes for every single attack.
Ensuring no victim's blood ever transferred to his daily wear.
And incredibly, he intentionally wore oversized shoes during the murders.
The oversized shoes are a classic, highly effective forensic countermeasure that shows a deep understanding of investigative techniques.
Because he knew exactly how the rural police operated.
He knew that because they lacked DNA technology and high-definition cameras, they relied heavily on basic footprint analysis.
Measuring the depth and size of a footprint in the mud to determine height and weight.
By intentionally wearing shoes several sizes too large and altering his gait, Yang completely distorted their physical profile of him.
The rural police were wasting their meager resources looking for a much larger, heavier, clumsier man.
And by discarding his bloody clothes in fast-moving rivers and meticulously burying his murder weapons in the soft dirt near local ancestral tombs.
Areas people avoided.
He was systematically destroying the physical link between himself and the crime scene.
To truly understand the devastating reality of this MO, we need to look at an illustrative case, the Lu Nao family massacre.
Okay.
This happened on the bitterly cold night of December 6, 2002, in Siping County, Henan. A local farmer named Lu Zanwei is asleep in his main farmhouse.
Also sleeping in the house are his mother, his wife, his young son, and his daughter.
At roughly 1 a.m., Xinhai silently forces entry into the home carrying a heavy iron hammer.
In the span of perhaps 5 to 10 minutes, moving from bed to bed in the dark, he bludgeons the farmer, the mother, the wife, and the 2 children.
5 people. 3 generations of a single bloodline. Wiped out before they even had a chance to scream.
It's horrifying.
The only reason anyone from that family lived to tell the tale is due to a sheer fluke of timing.
The grandfather.
Yeah. The 68-year-old grandfather, Lu Zongguan, happened to be sleeping in a newly built, unfinished house on the edge of the property that specific night, purely to guard construction materials from thieves.
The grandfather woke up the next morning, likely expecting to have breakfast with his grandchildren. He walked over to the main house, opened the door, and found his entire lineage destroyed.
The reports note the walls and ceilings were covered in blood, cast off from the hammer swings.
It is a level of intimate, physical violence that is almost incomprehensible to a healthy brain.
It requires a complete, terrifying detachment from human empathy to stand over a sleeping child and swing an iron hammer.
It truly does.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, specifically regarding how we classify him.
How so?
You watch Hollywood movies or read true crime paperbacks, and the media always portrays serial killers in a strict binary.
Right. They are either sophisticated, organized masterminds who play chess with the police, leave notes, drive luxury cars.
Like Hannibal Lecter or Ted Bundy.
Or they are bumbling, disorganized lunatics who strike out blindly, leave their wallets at the crime scene, and live in squalor.
Yang Xinhai shatters that binary. He used a crude iron hammer, he rode a rusty bicycle, he slept in ditches.
He looks, on the surface, like the absolute definition of a disorganized, impulsive vagrant.
But when you look at the meticulous forensic awareness, the oversized shoes, the sourcing of new clothes, the deliberate avoidance of motorized checkpoints, a complete tactical annihilation of witnesses.
He wasn't disorganized at all.
He was a highly sophisticated, hyper-adapted apex predator. He understood his specific environment perfectly.
You hit on a major debate in modern criminology. He was an absolute master of his specific socio-geographic ecology.
He understood the logistical blind spots of the Chinese police force better than the regional police chiefs did.
He knew intuitively that a man on a bicycle in the rural dark is effectively invisible. He knew that a discarded, rusty hammer found near a farming village is just a piece of scrap metal.
Not a murder weapon.
He seamlessly blended the extreme, chaotic brutality of a disorganized killer with the cold, tactical precision of an organized one.
This hybrid nature made him almost impossible for authorities to profile using traditional Western metrics.
They were looking for a profile that simply didn't exist in his reality.
And yet, despite all that terrifying brilliance, despite 3 years of outsmarting an entire nation's law enforcement apparatus, his actual capture was completely anticlimactic.
Wasn't a brilliant detective connecting red string on a corkboard.
No, it happened on November 3rd, 2003, in Kangzhou, which is a bustling city in Hebei province. He's just hanging out at a recreation center, an internet cafe near a busy railway station.
And there is just a routine, low-level police check going on.
Standard street-level policing.
It was incredibly mundane. The police are simply walking through the crowd, checking state IDs, looking for petty pickpockets, unlicensed vendors, or undocumented migrants who had overstayed.
They had no idea they were in the presence of a mass murderer.
Exactly.
But as the officers are doing their routine sweep, they notice this guy acting incredibly suspiciously. Let's talk about the visual cues of paranoia.
He's loitering. His eyes are darting around. His body language is rigid.
He looks profoundly nervous. So the officers casually approach him to ask for his ID. And instead of playing it cool, instead of just handing over a fake ID or paying a small bribe, Yang utterly panics.
The internal pressure breaks.
He flees toward a dark culvert near the train tracks. The officers, thinking they're chasing a petty thief, run him down, and a violent physical struggle ensues in the dirt.
Yang actually pulls out a concealed folding knife and attempts to stab the arresting officers.
Before they finally use overwhelming physical force to subdue him and get the cuffs on his wrists.
It's the classic fatal mistake of the hypervigilant serial offender. They survive for years by being invisible, blending into the background noise.
But the exact moment authority actually stops and looks them directly in the eye.
Their internal paranoia overwhelms their tactical discipline. Their fight-or-flight response short-circuits, and they react with explosive, unwarranted violence.
Instantly flagging themselves as highly dangerous individuals.
If he had simply smiled and handed over a fake ID, he likely would have walked out of that train station.
So they drag him into the local precinct, they start a standard interrogation, and they run his fingerprints to pull his record.
And the local cops see the previous decades-old stints in the labor camps for stealing a tray.
They see the 1996 conviction for the brutal attempted rape and the severed tongue. And suddenly, the bureaucratic alarm bells start ringing at deafening volumes.
Because while Yang was out riding his bicycle, the central authority, the Ministry of Public Security in Beijing, had been quietly but desperately investigating a string of linked mass murders in the Xinhai area.
And thanks to the recent modernization efforts that were just beginning to be implemented in major hubs, the central MPS actually had viable DNA samples recovered from several of the crime scenes.
They run his freshly drawn blood against the new national database.
And it pings as a perfect match. The terrifying ghost on the bicycle suddenly has a name, a face, and a rap sheet.
And this is where the psychological profile comes full circle. Once the incontrovertible scientific evidence of the DNA match corners him, the psychological dam completely breaks.
He realizes the game is over.
He drops the facade entirely and provides an exhaustive, almost proud, hyper-detailed confession, casually admitting to the exact mechanics of 67 murders and 23 rapes.
Let's delve deep into the text of that confession, because this is where we have to confront the raw, unfiltered psychology of absolute nihilism.
Right.
When the news of his arrest finally broke the censorship barrier, the media scrambled frantically for a motive. They wanted a reason that made sense to normal, empathetic people.
They wanted a neat, consumable narrative.
So the tabloids latched onto this unverified story that back in 1992, his childhood sweetheart in the village had broken his heart and married someone else because he was too poor.
They tried desperately to frame him as a scorned lover.
A tragic romantic figure driven to madness by a broken heart.
Which is a pathetic, transparent attempt by a terrified society to rationalize the profoundly irrational.
We desperately want to believe that monsters are created by relatable human heartbreak.
If he killed because his heart was broken, we can understand that. It makes the world feel slightly less terrifying, slightly more predictable.
But you dismiss that narrative entirely. You don't buy the broken heart theory for a second.
I dismiss it entirely because Xinhai himself dismissed it with terrifying clarity. His own words, meticulously recorded during the interrogation, are the most chilling aspect of this entire deep dive.
What did he say?
He explicitly, coldly denied any grand romantic narrative of revenge for a lost love. He looked at the interrogators, and I quote his exact translation, "When I killed people, I had a desire. This inspired me to kill more. I don't care whether they deserve to live or not. It is none of my concern. I have no desire to be part of society. Society is not my concern."
Society is not my concern. That is the voice of the absolute void. It is a black hole of empathy.
It is absolute distilled nihilism. If we classify him typologically based on the established criminological literature, he is a horrifying hybrid of a hedonistic and a power-assertive killer.
He didn't kill for financial gain.
No, although he occasionally took small amounts of cash or food from the farmhouses purely to survive the journey to the next town.
He didn't kill for a twisted political or religious ideology either.
He killed because the mechanical act of murder, the physical exertion of absolute, terrifying, unchallengeable control over the life and death of another human being, provided him with a profound psychological and physical satisfaction.
It was a compulsion, a desire, as he called it.
Having been entirely stripped of power, dignity, and social standing his entire life. From the cow stall to the labor camp to the severed tongue, he replaced normal human interaction with the ultimate irreversible act of destruction.
In those dark, bloody bedrooms of those rural farmhouses, he ceased to be an impoverished outcast. He became a god.
Exactly.
It's horrifying because it is just so hollow. There's no grand, complex motive for a behavioral scientist to untangle. There's just an empty, marginalized man filling himself up with the pain and terror of others.
Which brings us to the rapid trial and the violent end of his life.
February 1st, 2004. He stands trial at the Luohe City Intermediate People's Court. The entire judicial proceeding is conducted strictly behind closed doors.
The state officially claimed this was to protect the identities and privacy of the rape victims, which is a standard and valid legal procedure.
But let's be honest, it also highly conveniently kept the horrific, embarrassing details of the state's massive failure to catch him out of the public eye.
And away from international journalists. It was a swift, highly controlled, almost performative judicial process. The state needed to definitively demonstrate to a terrified populace that order had been violently restored.
The monster was in a cage, and the system was functioning perfectly.
And Yang's behavior during the trial is described by witnesses as an insidious calm.
He didn't rant against the judge. He didn't cry for his mother.
He didn't offer a shred of apology to the families of the victims.
When the inevitable death sentence was handed down, he simply nodded and accepted it. He flatly stated he would not waste time filing an appeal.
But his only final request to the court, and this is an incredibly bizarre, jarring detail, was that he formally requested to donate his internal organs to the state if his life couldn't be spared.
Analyzing that final request is fascinating. It is likely a final, twisted, manipulative attempt to exert control over his own narrative right at the end.
Perhaps it was a momentary, confusing flicker of a desire to be seen as biologically useful to the society he despised.
Or, more likely, it was just a sociopathic calculation designed to confuse his captors. A gesture that ultimately meant nothing at all.
The request was denied.
He was executed by firing squad on February 14th, 2004. A single gunshot, just 14 days after his trial concluded.
The state erased his existence almost as quickly and efficiently as he had erased his victims.
So what does this all mean? We have followed this terrifying, bloody journey of a man born in a cow stall who weaponized his invisibility to become the Monster of Henan and then was executed by a bullet to the back of the head. What is the ultimate, enduring takeaway from his psychological profile?
The primary takeaway is that Yang Xinhai represented a total, irreversible void of empathy. But crucially, that void was initially carved out by extreme poverty and familial neglect.
It was then systematically deepened by the brutal, unchecked exploitation of the migrant labor system.
And it was finally irreversibly cemented by the severe trauma of his incarceration and physical disfigurement. He is the terrifying, logical end state of absolute societal marginalization.
When a human being is taught over decades that the social contract offers them absolutely nothing, no physical protection, no inherent dignity, no hope for a future,
They inevitably realize they are freed from the obligations of that contract. Yang didn't just break the rules of society, he completely unlearned the fundamental concept of humanity.
which forces us to pivot and look at the society that failed to stop him for so long. Let's move to the legacy of this case.
The massive sweeping shift in Chinese criminal investigation that immediately followed his execution.
Because his spree didn't just end 67 lives. It violently ended an entire era of how policing was done in the world's most populous nation.
The systemic overhaul following his capture was immediate, well-funded, and profound. The Ministry of Public Security faced a brutal internal reckoning.
The undeniable realization that a single uneducated laborer riding a rusty bicycle could mercilessly exploit the gaps in their system for 3 years.
Slaughtering entire families across 4 provinces without triggering an alarm was a massive national embarrassment and an unacceptable security crisis.
It proved to the central government that the siloed provincial analog model of policing was entirely obsolete in the new era of the massive floating population.
So what actual mechanical changes occurred? How did they fix the blind spots that he had driven a bicycle through?
Well, the Yang Xinhai case was the primary, undeniable catalyst for the rapid integration of provincial criminal databases.
The Ministry of Public Security issued strict mandates that local precincts could no longer hoard their local data to protect their closure rates.
Fingerprint scans, criminal records, outstanding warrants, and crucially, DNA profiles had to be digitized, shared, and synchronized at a national level.
The system fundamentally changed. If a man committed a violent crime in Henan today and was arrested for vagrancy or public intoxication in Hebei tomorrow,
The centralized computer system would instantly flag his identity and his history. That invisible force field at the provincial border was completely dismantled by fiber optic cables and centralized servers.
they also started pouring massive amounts of federal money into the rural areas.
Oh, heavily. That staggering 1 to 2,386 police-to-citizen ratio simply couldn't stand if they wanted to maintain the appearance of public stability.
They began heavily investing in rural policing technology and manpower. This case marked the dawn of the massive, interconnected surveillance infrastructure that characterizes modern rural China today.
They installed thousands of public security cameras at remote rural intersections. They upgraded communication networks so a cop on a dirt road could radio a central dispatcher.
They provided rural officers with digital terminals in their cruisers. They realized the hard way that you cannot police a highly mobile, modernized population with magnifying glasses and paper cards.
Furthermore, the case forced a broader, uncomfortable societal reckoning regarding the extreme vulnerability of the rural poor.
The government had to publicly acknowledge that the celebrated economic boom had left millions of agrarian farmers totally defenseless.
And that the management of the migrant labor force required more than just checking IDs at train stations. It required creating actual functional systems of tracking, housing, and social support.
It's an incredible dark irony, really. Yang's entire horrific spree was born out of a desire to destroy society.
He hated the system, he hated the people in it, and his stated goal was to inflict maximum chaos and pain.
But the ultimate historical result of his rampage was that he forced that very society to rapidly evolve. He took a hammer and smashed it against every single crack in their bureaucratic armor.
And by exposing those cracks so violently, he forced the state to build a much stronger, interconnected, and technologically advanced protective net.
The monster inadvertently provided the exact blueprints needed to create a much more resilient cage.
It is a dark paradox that we see often in sociology. The extreme violence of the marginalized often inadvertently accelerates the modernization of the very systems of control they are rebelling against.
He thought he was tearing the system down, but he was actually serving as its ultimate stress test.
To briefly summarize the terrifying, exhaustive journey we've taken today, we have looked clinically and thoroughly at the Monster of Henan,
We analyzed a killer who was born in the grinding, inescapable poverty of rural China.
who was hardened and educated by a brutal labor and penal system, and who was actively enabled by a fractured, underfunded, and localized security apparatus.
He weaponized his own societal invisibility, using the massive economic migration of the era as his perfect cover.
To carry out a mathematically precise, horrific campaign of annihilation against the most vulnerable, defenseless members of society.
And while the specific forensic and technological gaps that allowed him to operate, the lack of DNA databases, the paper fingerprint cards, the provincial silos have largely been closed by modern surveillance, the underlying sociological and psychological questions of his existence remain entirely unresolved.
Which leaves us with a chilling final thought for you to mull over as we conclude this deep dive. Today, law enforcement agencies around the world, including the massive apparatus in China, have robust, real-time national DNA databases.
They have high-definition facial recognition cameras on almost every street corner.
They have instant satellite-linked communication to track criminals the second their name enters the digital system. The physical geographic blind spots of the early 2000s are largely gone.
But here's the fundamental question. Can any amount of digital surveillance, can any sophisticated tracking algorithm truly detect the invisible internal breaking point of a severely marginalized human being?
We can track the bicycle now with terrifying precision, but how do we stop the creation of the monster before they decide they have absolutely nothing left to lose?
That is the true existential challenge of a modern, interconnected society. Our technology is brilliant at catching the predators once they strike, but we remain profoundly unequipped to prevent the formation of the psychological void that creates them in the first place.
Thank you for joining us on this intense, heavy deep dive into the source material. We know it was dark and the details were grim, but exploring these shadows is how we truly understand the complex structures that keep us safe. Stay curious, keep questioning the world around you, and we'll see you next time.